Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific. Hello, welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. My name's Richard Dunley, and I'm joined by my co-host Jennifer Parker. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we unpack the key developments that have been happening over the past couple of weeks in maritime security in the Indo-Pacific region and beyond. We're recording on Thursday, the 11th of December. It's already December, which is slightly scary. And I suspect this is probably going to be our last recording before Christmas. But anyway, as ever, there has been a lot happening recently. And so if we don't mention something that happens after the afternoon of the 11th of December, that's why. There's a fair bit that we won't be mentioning anyway, because we just don't have enough time to fit everything in. But there's lots to discuss, so we might as well get going. Hey, Jen, how are things?
I'm good. I think there's lots that we will, as you say, that we will end up leaving out because everything has been happening or feels like it's been happening. And I can't remember the last time we recorded. I think it was probably 3 weeks ago. I was reminded we had a fan, and Harry, if you're listening, it was wonderful to meet you at the NSC this week. What's been happening? Look, I've got a podcast out with Defence Connect with Steve Cooper and Kevin Quandra, talking about maritime readiness and a bit of Hunter and a bit of AUKUS and a bit of other things. And have another podcast out on a different Defence Connect channel coming out next week. So cross motion podcasts. I've been doing a lot thinking about AUSMIN, US national security strategies, and I had an article in the Sydney Morning Herald talking about the conversation we should have at AUSMIN, which is me continuing to prosecute the idea that we need to clearly outline our roles and responsibilities and the US's roles and responsibilities and start to delineate rather than integrate. But I won't bore you with that. You can read it on my website. And of course, we will get into this, but lots of discussion and speaking to the media about the Chinese Naval task group that is thought to be deep in the Pacific somewhere. So what have you been up to, Richard?
Me, I have been trying and largely failing in many ways to get some time to write something about sea power and the information environment. But that is more of an academic piece, so it won't be out for a little while. Hopefully, I'll manage to get some time over Christmas to crack on with that. But also, I've been following your discussion of the Chinese Naval Task Group, and I think we might have some fun with that one. Anyway, we ought to crack on. So what's been happening in the region? Well, what's not been happening in the region, but what are we going to talk about what's been happening in the region?
So, in the last week and a bit, we've seen the release of the US National Security Strategy. We won't really focus on that here. But following on from that, we did see the AUSMIN talks, which is the 2+2 talks between the US and Australia that occurs almost every year. The Department of War put out a tweet saying it was the 40th iteration of AUSMIN. I enjoyed correcting them and saying...
Okay.
The Department of War, yes.
You're going with...
correcting them. I'm just going with what their Twitter handle is. I don't care enough. But to get into it, that there is the 35th version of AUSMIN. Anyway, it started 40 years ago. 5 have been missed in the last 40 years. It seems
I
geeky
love
to
the level of pedantry there. That was excellent.
The only reason I even know, because I'm not normally a details person, as you would attest to, the only reason I even know is because I published an article on AUSMIN and the op editor called me and he said, my sub-editor is just challenging, is it the 35th, which is what you've written, or is it the 40th? And I said, no, in accordance with the DFAT website, here are all the ones, I've counted them, it's the 35th, and I was right. So that's the only reason I know that detail, by the way. I'm not an AUSMIN geek. I guess, AUSMIN... is always normally quite a significant, measure of the alliance to see where it has tracked in the last 12 months and where it's going in the future. Some people said that the statement from this AUSMIN was pretty boring. I don't think it was boring, I don't think it was more boring than other AUSMINs. I mean, I think they're generally pretty boring. It was probably shorter. But some of the key things that came out of it, I guess, clearly AUSMIN's not just about defence, so there was stuff on economic cooperation and foreign policy cooperation, which we won't really delve into. From a defence and national security perspective, there was a lot of focus on digital infrastructure and subsea cables in the Pacific, cooperation on maritime cooperative activities in the South China Sea. It's just an exercise. AUKUS, so full steam ahead on AUKUS, which is the famous quote from President Trump in October, a great nautical quote, was actually seemed to be quoted by all of the 4 principals at AUSMIN. So I guess that is now the motto of AUKUS, full steam ahead. There was some interesting stuff there around submarine rotation force west. Nothing really new, but a real focus on timelines and meeting critical timelines. So I think if you read behind that subtext, last week as well, the US AUKUS review was reportedly completed. The Australian government has a copy. It hasn't been made public. A lot was made of that in the media, but also the UK review wasn't made public, and our own review into the ASA wasn't made public, so I don't think that's a huge issue. But I guess there was some focus on timeframes there, and that was kind of re-emphasised in AUSMIN as well. The final kind of point that really came out of AUSMIN was the focus on force posture initiatives, predominantly the Air Force posture initiative. So we know about the Enhanced Air Coordination Force Posture Initiative, which has seen bombers rotating through the Northern Air bases and the US investing in Australia's Northern Air bases. This one seemed to open up the aperture to include ISR, Intelligence, Surveillance, Reconnaissance aircraft, and fighter aircraft. So clearly this is becoming more of an emphasis. The other key point, I think, was the guided weapons, explosives, ordnance focus of it. It mentioned co-production and co-sustainment of a few missiles, mainly air-launched missiles between Australia and the US that I hadn't heard mentioned before publicly from a GUIO perspective, including the HACM hypersonic missile, which can be launched from F-35. So I think lots of positive. From a maritime perspective, did it really tell us anything new? I would say no. The other thing that came on the back of AUSMIN was the trilateral AUKUS talks, or the trilateral defence minister AUKUS talks. Again, no real new detail about AUKUS Pillar 1. AUKUS Pillar 2 is interesting, and I suspect we're learning some more about the US AUKUS review, because it says AUKUS Pillar 2, there were some statements about kind of refining AUKUS Pillar 2. I can't remember the quote from Richard Marles, but it seemed that there needed to be more focus on it. And there's been a lot written about the fact that AUKUS Pillar 2 is too broad. There's no clear hallmark projects or goals, or at least in the public domain, and no clear investment. So I think that's quite positive. What's your take on AUSMIN, AUKUS, AUKUS review, all of these discussions which seem to meld into each other in the last week?
Yeah, so they do kind of all seem to merge together. And then there's the slightly odd, dissonant background of the US national security strategy, which, as I think we were mentioning before, there's a slight sort of disconnect between the rhetorics coming through. In terms of the AUSMIN stuff, a couple of things that I think are worth sort of flagging from more of a foreign policy perspective. One of the things that did come across as notable is the fact there was no mention of a lot of the preambles to the AUSMIN type statements generally talk about shared values, democracy, etc. There was none of that, which not surprising, but I thought was quite notable. I was intrigued by, there was a statement as part of the AUSMIN statement said that they reaffirmed the criticality of establishing submarine rotational force west as early as 2027. Now, whether or not that is a sort of, whether I'm trying to read too much into this or there is any notion of that timeline slipping, I'm not sure, but it did flag with me as a, this might be as early as means that it could be later, right? Now, since then, Richard Marles has again mentioned Q4 2027. So I might be reading too much into that, but I thought it was quite interesting. In terms of the AUKUS gathering stuff, I've not seen anything particularly interesting out of Pillar 1. The only thing, again, that was notable to a degree was some of the language, particularly coming out of the UK side, around the fact that AUKUS was being rebooted. Now, I don't know, again, quite what that means, but it seemed to be interesting. Pillar 2 was obviously the focus, at least in sort of some of the statements that have come out. Richard Marles talked about giving a sharpness to Pillar 2, which I think is a perfectly reasonable kind of subtle critique of what's been there sort of previously, which is certainly in the public domain. AUKUS Pillar 2 has been a pretty amorphous entity. The other thing which I thought, again, was interesting was obviously there was a lot of fanfare around AUKUS as part of this, and a lot of discussion about AUKUS. But it came, certainly from the UK side, it came at a time when there were statements made by the UK government yesterday that they were effectively cutting back very significantly on their deployments outside of the Euro-Atlantic area and exercises and training beyond this area. So I think there's something quite interesting going on there, where you're seeing a rhetorical piece and I guess focus on maybe on capability, where there's this engagement in AUKUS in the broader Indo-Pacific, but in terms of what's actually happening in terms of capability and what they're doing, you're seeing very much of a focusing in on the Euro-Atlantic. So slightly jarring messaging, I guess, there. So that was my sort of tuppence, I guess, on those.
Look, I think you're right about the messaging. I think the UK is a very much invested partner in AUKUS, and we've talked about this many times in terms of how much AUKUS actually helps their submarine industrial base rather than hinders it. But there is the question about phase 1 of AUKUS Pillar 1 and the idea of an astute rotating out of Stirling. I find that unlikely. Happy to stand corrected. I have no problems with it. But if you just look at the state of the astute fleet at the moment, anyone that can do maths would have to ask some genuine questions about that. And so I think that this messaging around focusing on the Euro-Atlantic is probably setting us up for some point a statement saying that, the UK remains invested, but there's no astute that's going to rotate out of Stirling, which is, probably a pretty reasonable comment, to be honest.
Absolutely. Moving on, the story that has been gaining quite a lot of attention in Australian media is the discussion of the Chinese task force that is somewhere in the Pacific. Now, this was something that flagged, I guess, probably a week or so ago now?
Actually, in late November. So it was the end of November. There was an article in the Fin Review that talked about the fact that there was some reporting of a Chinese naval task group that might be on its way to the Pacific or potentially in the vicinity of Australia. And again, of course, Chinese naval task groups deploy like naval task groups in other countries, including Australia. The difference is really that what is the perceived changes in the way they're operating rather than it being a specific issue. And of course, because of the circumnavigation of Australia, who can forget that? In February, March this year, it catches the imagination a little bit more.
Yes. So anyway, it's been very much on a source of discussion. There have been lots of questions raised in Senate estimates and with politicians and defence officials. It has come out that the composition of the task force is one Type 75 LHD, so an amphibious ship, a Type 55 cruiser, so a very large, very powerful surface combatant, a Type 54A frigate, and a replenishment ship. So this is a similar in some ways task force to that which circumnavigated Australia previously, but with the addition of a large amphibious platform, which of course adds a slightly different makeup to or sort of flavour to the mix. There was initially quite a lot of discussion about the idea of this task force coming down towards Australia. Since then, it has shifted somewhat to, and the assumption seems to be that it is going to be heading out into the Pacific and perhaps down into the South Pacific. But at the moment, nobody really knows quite well. Certainly in the public domain, at least, nobody really knows quite what is going on. The point that I would make, and I've made this publicly, is it is still a very, very long way away. And there's been quite a lot of discussion about something that is still a very large distance from Australia. So when there was discussion in Senate estimates, the task force was roughly 500 miles north of Palau. That is still about just over 3,000 kilometres north of Australia. It has obviously moved significantly since then, and I think Jen has been talking to people and been trying to work out roughly where it might be. But the assumption is it is somewhere further out into the Pacific. So you've been talking a lot about this, Jen. So what's your take on this?
Well, look, I think never miss an opportunity to get the media excited about China's Navy and to get Australia as a nation focused on the maritime domain. Look, I think this is interesting. I think it's great that we're talking about it. Of course, it's a conversation about how China's naval deployments have gradually changed and how their capabilities have evolved, as opposed to a conversation about this being anywhere near or any threat to Australia. And I think keeping that conversation focused on what it tells us about China's naval capability and their evolving deployments is important. Look, I thought this was significant from my research, and I'm happy to be corrected if you're a big old geek, but from my research, this seemed to be the second time a Type 75, which is quite a large amphibious vessel. It's about 40,000 tonnes. Australia's LHDs, Adelaide and Canberra, are at about 25,000 tonnes. The Type 75 is quite a new vessel. In fact, they're still building them in China. The first one that looks like it actually exited the first island chain was 2023 and not really since then. And China doesn't normally deploy, I'm sure they will increasingly, but hasn't historically normally deployed amphibious task groups outside of the first island chain generally. So I think it's interesting that they're doing this. Is it surprising? No, it's not surprising. It's just another demonstration of their increasing deployments. In terms of where it is, look, who knows where it is? I guess my kind of estimates yesterday, I think they were reported in the ABC, were, well, if it turned around and went back into the first island chain, we'd likely know. Generally, the ships operating around that area are fairly closely reported on by a series of, maritime domain awareness websites and on the internet. If it had continued its southeasterly course and come down through to the Coral Sea, it would be here by now. And last time that there was a Chinese naval task group in the Coral Sea was in February this year, and that was reported by the Australian government. So it makes sense that it either continued to head east or east-southeast, which would put it heading across the Pacific, probably down to the South Pacific. And a task group like that generally would travel around 13 knots. There's no point for them to just sit and stop in the water and do nothing in the middle of the ocean. Ships don't normally do that. So it's probably traveled, I think yesterday I thought about 5,000 kilometers since the location was last reported on the 1st of December in the public domain. So look, I think it's interesting. I think it's good to have the Australian. That's right. We're not meant to say interesting. And someone put on our YouTube a bunch of examples of words we could use that weren't interesting, and I forgot them all. But I think it's good to have the Australian public listening and thinking about China's naval capability and what that means for Australia, but in a way that is informed as opposed to in a way that is alarmed. And that was probably the challenge around the Task Group 107 that circumnavigated Australia earlier this year.
Yeah, I must say I'm slightly in two minds about this one, particularly some of the very early reporting. And I always think it's interesting to conceive of how some of this reporting would be viewed from elsewhere. So the idea that Australia is all of a sudden very focused and lots of media attention on Chinese warships, which are a very, very long way away from Australia. whereas lots of our partners in the region, this is something that is absolutely daily activity for them, whether this be Korea, Japan, Philippines, Vietnam, etc. Having Chinese warships sailing in the waters around them is very, very common. So I think that there's something slightly odd there around some of the response to this. I do think that this is something where we are going to have to get used to this because it is going to happen more and more, and even down to things like there's indications that the Chinese are beginning to build more replenishment vessels, which has been one of the things where they've had relatively few for the size of navy that they've had, and they're investing more in this. So I think we're likely to see more expeditionary type deployments from the Chinese Navy, which is going to bring them very much more into our region. So I'm uncomfortable to a degree about the level of attention this has got. Although I do agree with you that the more we talk about developments more broadly, that is a positive thing, and we do need to acculturate the Australian public to the fact that we are going to be living in a world where there is significant Chinese maritime, not only naval, but also Coast Guard and other presence in our broader region. That is going to be a fact of life.
Look, I agree with most of your comments, but I would say there is a difference. And this isn't a question of whether they should or shouldn't be. That's really not part of this conversation. But there is a difference between Chinese naval task groups operating near Japan and South Korea, which are next to China, and Chinese naval task groups operating in the Pacific. It's not that one poses a threat or one's more of an issue than the other, but it is a difference. It's a change in pattern. So it's different to have a Chinese naval task group sail all the way to the Southwest Pacific or down to Australia than it is to see one near Japan. So I think that there's, the geography there gives away a different kind of perspective. I agree with you that some of the reporting has been a bit bonkers. There was one article that talked about this task group's got more firepower than the Royal Australian Navy, which it doesn't. There's questions about the Royal Australian Navy certainly needs to be able to get more missiles to sea, and that's the upgrade of Megami is part of that plan. But I think some of the reporting, yes, but I think most of the reporting hasn't been that extreme. Not like the level we had in February, March. And I think, what is the alternative? The alternative is it's not discussed, which means the Australian public isn't learning about what is a changing naval power in our region. So there's my pushback.
Fair?
No, keep going. We can talk about this for 40 minutes.
No, we've got it. We have lots of other things to talk about, Jen. We cannot.
But they're not as interesting. All right.
Rabbit on about this.
All right.
Japan. Activities of the Chinese Navy that I think we can perhaps agree on.
Aircraft carriers, Chinese aircraft carriers around Japan is more common than amphibious task groups in the Pacific. Nowadays.
Locking their fire control radars onto Japanese fighters is perhaps, I think we could agree, more provocative than sailing
I agree with you there.
3,000 miles from Australia. So this is the reporting that on the Japanese Ministry of Defense on the 6th of December announced that I think it was then 2 days before, 2 Chinese J-15 fighter aircraft, which have been launched from the Chinese Liaoning aircraft carrier, which has been doing a circumnavigation around Japan. They were being monitored. The activities were being monitored by Japanese Air Self-Defense Force F-15s. And on 2 separate occasions, the Chinese fighter jets locked their fire control radars onto the Japanese fighters. Now, this is it's certainly not unheard of, going back to Cold War type era activities. In fact, this was relatively common, but even then was seen very much as a provocative kind of statement. And it is something that is, I think, relatively unusual now. It's certainly not been reported as something that has been happening regularly. And Japan has pushed this quite hard, and they've described it as dangerous and unacceptable, and flagged the risks of escalation, which I think are quite clear. Now, what I think is really interesting about this one is the degree to which China pushed back very strongly against the Japanese criticism. Previously, China has often kind of pushed back gently, but then kind of let the matter slide. Whereas on this occasion, they were pretty aggressive in their pushback, saying that it was routine and accusing the Japanese of being dangerous and all sorts of other things. Now, obviously, this fits into a pattern of heightened tension between Japan and China over the past month or so. Now, how much that plays into this, obviously, we don't know. But it is certainly an uncomfortable pattern of behaviour, and one that has potentially significant escalatory ramifications if it becomes a regular thing. What were your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think look, I think it is probably heightened as well because of the coercion of Japan that's been going on for a number of weeks now in the economic domain and the military domain, and we mentioned that. I think that China pushed back hard. I think this is becoming a bit of a trend when China is accused of doing things or things come up. You're starting to see more statements from China and more strongly worded statements. And we saw that actually in October. There was an incident where an Australian maritime patrol aircraft was harassed in the international airspace in the South China Sea. And that was released by the Australian government. And China came back and pushed back forcefully, saying that we were in Chinese airspace, etc. So I think the pushback is part of a, I guess, more assertive China that I think is probably feeling a little bit emboldened. There was some critique or commentary that during the first few weeks of the coercion of Japan that was clearly occurring in response to some statements by the Japanese Prime Minister, that there hadn't been a lot of statements from key allies and partners in support of Japan. We did see that in the wake of this incident with the radars being locked onto a Japanese fighter aircraft. We saw a statement from Richard Marles, Australia's Defence Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, when he was in Japan on the weekend, and we've now seen a statement from the US condemning China's actions. So I think all of that kind of plays into how far Japan pushed this incident as well. It is serious. I think it's probably going to become more common, to be honest. And, in terms of, yes, it's very dangerous. In terms of the maritime domain, we talk about escalations all the time, trying to ram ships and things like that. I mean, it's just, in some ways, it's a consistent pattern of aggressive behaviour. But yeah, it's kind of my take, to be honest. See what comes next.
Yeah, absolutely. And particularly as the Chinese have more aircraft carriers fully operational and are deploying them more regularly into the region. We'll see what happens. We don't have huge amounts of time. So moving on and talking about some of the capability things that have happened in the past couple of weeks. I guess one of the big news stories was the cancellation of the US Constellation class frigate program. This was the American kind of smaller combatant. It was a project that was developed to effectively follow on from and largely replace the troubled littoral combat ship program. And the Americans had decided to go with an established design, and they ended up going with the Franco-Italian Frem class frigate. Fincantieri were building these at a yard in Wisconsin. Now, everyone has known that the Constellation class program has had some significant challenges for some time, particularly over the level of changes that have been made to the design. So originally what was supposed to be 15% changes went up to 85% changes. Now, obviously, all of those numbers don't actually mean a lot once you start thinking practically, but the reality, obviously, is that they very heavily redesigned the vessels. They have the American Secretary of Navy announced a week or so ago now that they had cancelled the remaining 4 vessels. So 2 are going to be built. The remaining 4 are going to get cancelled. The expectation had been that this would probably be a longer run of shipbuilding anyway. So this is a significant cut. Now, there's then been some interesting kind of discussion around what next. Obviously, the failures of the Littoral Combat Ship Program, the fact that DDG-X, which is supposed to be the destroyer that replaces the Arleigh Burke, is still a very long way in the future. And so American shipbuilding has had some real problems recently. And there's a kind of a big question over, well, what do you replace it with? And I must say, I'm skeptical. There was some announcement or discussion this morning I saw in which Phelan was saying that they're planning on having a replacement frigate in the water of an American design in 2028, which sounds optimistic, let's say. I find it very, very difficult to see how that is likely to happen, but maybe I'll be proved wrong. But certainly it was a big story, and I suspect not really necessarily a particularly good one in terms of American capability and speed of greater capability and greater getting more ships into the water. Thoughts on this one?
Yeah, look, I guess I wasn't surprised when it was announced. There'd been a lot of messaging that the program had just, fundamentally blown out in terms of cost, in terms of time, and a lot of that was due to the changes. I mean, you're basically building a new ship when you're changing the length of the hull, right? Which was part of this. I guess, though, in the announcement of the cancellation, there was a lot of focus from the US Secretary of the Navy on this is going to speed up shipbuilding. And get more ships in the water quicker. And I just don't know how that possibly works if they haven't announced yet what the replacement is. Now, what I would honestly love to see at this point, and I know they're not going to do this, but working, potentially with Hanwha, who's trying to expand into the US, and having some sort of Korean design or joint Korean US design, and pushing something like that out. The idea that they would, I'm not a naval architect, but the idea that they would be able to design a US frigate, and the US has not built frigates since the Oliver Hazard Perry class, which is, I think they built their last one in the 80s, might be early 90s, that they would be able to design and produce a US frigate by 2028 does seem unlikely. Great if they can do it. Absolutely, that would be fantastic. But I guess there's a lot of challenges around this. Interesting too, they're going to still build the first 2, which have started build, the Constellation and the Congress. FFG's Constellation is, I think, about 12% built. I guess that was partially to keep shipbuilding going at the yard that has been building. And one of the issues in the US with shipbuilding, my understanding is anyway, is because of the stop and start nature, they've been struggling to get the workforce to come back on. So I guess that's a good decision. But now you're ending up with a Navy that has, 3 Zumwalt destroyers, 2 frigates that'll be produced, some LCS of different types. It's not really ideal. So I guess we'll see what is to come for this.
Yeah, I find it all a very odd set of decisions. Even the idea that, like, the program was clearly troubled and had some significant issues, but the idea that you're going to get more capability faster by cutting the program and starting again doesn't seem to make any sense at all. Some of the discussion that was came out of the initial announcement around the focus on uncrewed platforms, and these kind of sort of asymmetric type approaches. Again, I just
don't
hated
the term asymmetric.
I do. I absolutely hate it. But no, I like it when it's used in its appropriate form.
Fair enough.
But the idea of other solutions instead of building surface combatants, or crewed surface combatants at least. But again, I just don't think they're going to give you the capability that you need in the time frame that they're looking for. Now, the other thing that did vaguely also flag with me is the real focus in a lot of the discussion on the fact that this is a European design, and a very strong push about the recent announcement about the fact that it's an all-American ship, which again, I find that the whole thing a little bit odd. But we also don't know about what was actually going on inside the program. So we only have the public statements.
And I think really it's kind of where are they in 12 months from now, and what have they done with it? I mean, I do think that in some ways, and I'm not saying that this should have necessarily been cancelled. I honestly don't have enough knowledge about this program. But I think in some ways there is some courage as well to cancel a program when it is not working. And sometimes that is the right decision. I guess we won't know whether that's the case in this one, right?
No, absolutely not.
Good shipbuilding news, though. Let's have some good shipbuilding news. So I thought this was really positive, because we normally just have bad shipbuilding news, right? But so the US has been focusing on a new medium landing ship for their Marines, which they've decided to go with the Dutch-built Armored LST-100, which they're going to produce over 35 of. Now, if that rings a bell for an Australian listener, it should, because that is the design that's been selected for Australia's Landing Craft Heavy as well, which our Australian Army is getting an ADA being produced allegedly in the late 20s at Henderson. So I thought that was good. There's going to be some commonality between the Marines and the Army. Now, I wouldn't be surprised under the Force Posture Initiatives if once these are built, you see some of these based or rotating through Australia. And I think I cheekily put out a tweet that maybe we can build some for them. I don't think that's going to happen, but still, I mean, they may well be an Austal build in the US, since Austal are building them for us here. There's got to be some synergies somewhere.
Yeah, I think it sounds like generally a good news story in that regard. And I think it's also good that finally there is movement on the new landing craft for the US Marines. This has been something that's kind of been going around for a while, so hopefully it's going to actually happen. And as you say, synergies and in terms of things like maintenance and a whole host of other areas, seems to make a lot of sense. So hopefully a good news story. Other capability things. One of the announcements that's got quite a lot of attention recently, actually coming out of the UK, has been the official announcement of the UK's Atlantic Bastion, which is it was announced at a major sea power conference that took place over the past couple of days, and it was sort of officially launched by the new First Sea Lord. I guess he's not that new anymore. But Atlantic Bastion is basically a major undersea initiative to try and address the challenges to particularly, I guess, around both submarines, but also around critical maritime infrastructure and the threat, the Russian threat to critical maritime infrastructure. And Jenkins, First Sea Lord, made quite a lot of this in his speech, and really focused on threats both from surface, from Russian spy ships, which have got quite a lot of attention in the UK media, but also subsurface threats to critical maritime infrastructure. The Atlantic Bastion is supposedly a very new approach. They are relying very heavily on industry and on commercial partners to provide solutions, and they're looking very heavily into autonomous kit. So this is both autonomous surface vessels, but also autonomous undercrewed, undersea platforms. Undercrewed.
They're also undercrewed. I mean,
they are, yeah.
I haven't heard that term, but we're gonna. No. This is going to be a key term now. Undercrewed.
And the idea is to provide persistent underwater surveillance across the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, the famous kind of Cold War submarine operations zone. And it's very much reinvigorating that. Now, this is presented very much as the Royal Navy embracing technology and the development of a hybrid fleet and all of this kind of thing. Now, I am, as listeners may or may not know, deeply, deeply cynical. But my take on this to a large degree is the fact that this is a product of the fact that the Royal Navy doesn't have the regular kit it should be using to do this, because the Type 23s, I think they're now down to 7 Type 23s, which is the backbone of the ASW fleet for the UK. The Type 26s, which are replacing them, have not yet come on stream. And as Jen mentioned earlier, the UK submarine availability is disastrous at the moment. And so basically, there is a huge gaping hole in conventional capability. And so I think that there's a bit of a wing and a prayer here that new technology will solve all of the problems. I am skeptical, to say the least, but I hope I get proved wrong. What are your thoughts on Atlantic Bastion?
I keep thinking, I mean, I'm skeptical about a lot of solutions for uncrewed capabilities in the underwater domain and on the surface. And I keep asking myself, am I a technophobe? Is that why? And I like to think not. I just think that there is certainly a role, but I think that there are some practicalities that are difficult to overcome. And I think that there is a perception that doing it this way is going to be significantly cheaper. And I'm not sure that that's always the case either. I would have thought that, look, so don't get me wrong, by the way, I think announcing this and asking industry to put up proposals, I think that's fantastic. Like, I like that. But is it going to solve their problems? Look, I suspect not, to be honest. Solving their problems is accelerating shipbuilding. And to be honest, some sort of strategic towed array system like the US operate, go and get some RFA ships, chuck some large strategic towed arrays off the back of them, and maybe they can be used to queue some their new extra large UUV to hold a submarine at risk. I mean, I think that is a plausible scenario. That I've seen some different companies put out some different graphics about teaming USVs with the Type 26 and all this sort of stuff, and I'm just not sold on that. I know that all navies are talking about this idea of the hybrid fleet. But one of my challenges when it comes to the idea of having a USV that extends the capabilities or the strike capability or whatever capability of the major fleets that isn't focused purely on ISR, I think is a challenge, because I think we've talked about this, right? Like, it goes to the point of, okay, well, if you're designing it to have a strike capability, then it's going to be target number one unless you can protect it, or it has the ability to protect itself. It's not good to be tying up your major units to be protecting USVs, so it means you need to develop the ability to protect itself. The more complex capability you put on it, the more issue it is if that vessel is intercepted or seized. Also, the more maintenance that would need to occur. Anyone that's ever served on a warship would understand that there is a significant amount of maintenance on weapons that has to happen to keep them functioning, and all the systems that support it. Who's doing that? Like, I think that, and again, I don't want to be anti it. Like, I think that Navy should be exploring it. I'm certainly all for that, but I just think that there are some practicality issues that make it a challenge to be any kind of immediate solution. And I think in the end, this is the same conversation with Australia, right? I think countries need to grapple with that. If you require naval power or more broadly maritime power to protect your vital interests, then you have to invest in it, and it's expensive. And I don't think any technological solution is going to solve that problem in the next decade.
Yes, I absolutely agree. I certainly think in terms of the timeframes that the Royal Navy is discussing, I find it difficult to see it being the magic bullet solution.
And I noted that the First Sea Lord said that in his speech, and I'd commend his speech to anyone. I know it's not really Indo-Pacific, but it is a really good speech from the First Sea Lord. But it talks about the idea that the UK will have their first autonomous escort in the water within 2 years. So I'm a little bit curious as to what that that might be. And whether it's autonomous in its navigation, which of course there's been significant developments by many companies in terms of greater autonomy in navigation, or autonomous in its decision making around weapon systems, I think is unlikely in the next 2 years.
Well, that's within a time frame where we might actually be able to talk about this.
Maybe.
So we'll see.
Be proved wrong.
Absolutely. Anyway, we have probably reached about as long as we can. We have lots more things that we would like to talk about. Lots of things that we haven't managed to touch upon. But we don't want to keep all our listeners forever. So I think that's probably about all we've got time for on this particular episode. Good to chat as always, Jen.
Thanks so much, Richard. Great to see you.